In this movie we start with the topic of cameras. For this scene I use 3D models from the asset browser. For this you navigate to the asset browser, enter Redshift there. Then look for some 3D models. You can choose a table, for example, like I did, put two cups on it and maybe add a chair. In the background I use the backdrop object, that is the fillet. Enter backdrop for this. In this model I use the standard material. I lightened the color of the material a bit. Finally I added a dome light. Under light, select dome light and use an HDR. Now I start with the rendering. The result looks like this, and you can adjust the HDR to get a more pleasing image. Now we position our perspective camera close to a cup so that one object is in focus. For example, let's choose this perspective, like this. From this perspective we position a camera. For this we click on the standard camera icon, or you can navigate to Redshift at the top, select cameras and create a default camera, or just click here as that. Now we have our camera here. Of course we want to look through this camera by activating it. In our render view we make sure that render is selected at the top so that this view is rendered, or we can select the camera directly, RS camera in my case. Then this camera is always used for rendering. Next we click on the Redshift camera and navigate to the Object tab. Let's start with the type parameter. At the top you can select different lenses. For example, the fisheye lens, which is adjustable for 180 degrees, or spherical for a 360 degree image. Then you can also see the chair directly behind the camera, or you set it to cylindrical. Here you have another option. You can adjust the angle for the y-axis or switch to stereo spherical and create content for VR glasses. Setting it back to perspective now. With focal length we set the focal length. The smaller the value, the more fisheye effect we see. A higher value zooms closer with the camera. This changes the angle of view. We can adjust this separately with angle of view. We can move the perspective horizontally and vertically without changing the view. We reset that. With preset we set the sensor size under sensor. There you can choose different camera models. If you select a model, angle of view will be adjusted automatically. You can change the angle of view and the sensor size separately here. With log ratio you keep the set ratio. Both values are then changed at the same time, but you can also adjust independently, for example horizontally or about vertical. We can adjust this value directly. Next down here we can specify at what point the camera detects the geometry. I will switch from this view for a moment. Let's zoom in closer to see it better. Here's the camera currently capturing everything right in front of the lens. When I click on it we see this value. It starts right at the lens. When I change this value, a small square appears. This means the camera recognizes the geometry only from this point on. If I continue to the table and touch the cup, the camera only captures the image from here on. We can do the same with far clip plane. I activate it and zoom out further to see the far clip plane. Back here we see the big square. This is the far clip plane. If I adjust this slider we will specify up to where the camera considers the geometry. I move the value and go further back to the fillet. I'm almost there. Let's get a little closer. If I change it slowly, we can see in the preview how we can adjust the camera's field of view. I will drag it a little further. Now we are at the table and approaching the cap. We can also influence up to which point the camera considers the geometry. These were the parameters in the object area for now. I reset everything and disable it here. Continuing with the optical tab. In optical, you set the exposure of your image. Here you can set depth of field, motion blur and lens distortion. Two options are available for exposure. With EV only, there is only one parameter for brightness control, the exposure EV. If I move it to the right, it gets brighter. If I shift to left, darker. That's it. A very simple way to adjust the brightness. For professional photographic settings, switch to filmic. If I do this, the image will be brighter right away. Now various photographic parameters are active, like the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO value. We set the aperture via aperture. A higher value closes the aperture more and the image becomes darker. For example, if I choose an aperture of 16, the image will be darker accordingly. I reset this. With the shutter speed, we can adjust the exposure. You can find this under shutter time. A larger value corresponds to a faster shutter speed. A value of 1/250 approximately darkens the image. You can also adjust the exposure via the ISO value of the sensor. A higher ISO increases the sensitivity and makes the image brighter. A lower ISO, on the other hand, darkens it. Photography connoisseurs will quickly find their way around here. Let's return to EV only. Under exposure, there is the white point parameter. With this, you can adjust the white balance. Use the eyedropper, navigate to the rendering and select the desired color. Below that, vignetting allows you to adjust the vignetting. This is very user-friendly. Under depth of field, you can determine the focus point at focus distance, which is set to 2000 cm by default. Moving away from that, we see the focus point, the focus distance. I can enter values directly or select an object with the eyedropper. I'm now approaching the scene. To put the focus on the cup, I click on the eyedropper. And then on the cup itself, the square automatically adjusts to the cup. By clicking the middle mouse button and looking through the camera, I can have the focus distance displayed visually. This is done by selecting Display in the tab, followed by Focus Plane. The exact focus point is displayed on this large plane, where it can regulate the opacity. Of course, this representation can also be hidden. This is how I quickly set the focus point. I click on the optical button and want to set the focus point on the back cup. I notice that this level slides backwards. This tool makes it much easier to set the exact focus point. Oops, that was a mistake. I should use the eyedropper and focus on the front cup. An object can also be added by directly from the Object Manager. The center of the respective object is taken as focus distance. Now I will hide this layer for a moment. After that, I will switch back to optical. With the parameter aperture, I control the aperture and decide how wide open it should be. The smaller this value, the more visible the depth of field. It does not make sense to make any settings here at the moment because the depth of field is not yet activated. We activate this quite simple by checking the bouquet checkbox. After clicking on it, the blur will be visible immediately. Our focus is on the cup. This creates the depth of field. Depending on the settings under aperture, this can be enhanced. For example, if I enter a 2 here, the aperture opens. This results in more depth of field. The higher I set this value, the more depth of field we get. Now we can set the menu here. Thereupon we see various depth of field settings. Here we can specify what shape the bouquet should have. For example, there's the option circular. This means that the bouquet appears completely round. We can simulate a lower image quality by changing the bouquet with the aspect slider, turning the slider to the right. A horizontal distortion occurs, turned to the left, it becomes vertical. Resetting the slider. With spherical aberration, we create a round distortion. If I change the slider, the effect occurs. Here to I reset. Bladed determines how many blades our lens has. Under blades, I set the number. I try setting with 3. This results in 3 blades and thus a triangular bouquet. Let's take a look at aperture. I will increase the value to enhance the effect. At a value of 0.2, it becomes particularly obvious. I added an object that emphasizes the bouquet. This is a glowing cube. Activated, the triangular bouquet shows up. Back to the camera view. With aspect distortions are also possible here. As said before, we have spherical aberration, and at blades we define the number of blades. Angle allows us to rotate the bouquet at will. This I reset. You can also use your own bouquet file. With this we will use image. Under image you can upload a file. A black and white texture is ideal. It determines the bouquet shape. For the bouquet I use this image. I paste it in the field provided. You can immediately see that it acts as a bouquet. Resetting everything. I suggest a cut to make the movie shorter. So we have a first overview. In the Object tab we made camera settings and visualizations. Optical allowed brightness adjustment with different modes. We also worked with real camera values. In the next part we will look at other camera parameters.